Welcome to everyone joining us from both sides of the Atlantic and across the United States and North America. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Many of you know our institute already, but for those joining us for the first time, our mission is to deepen understanding of Germany and German-American relations through scholarship, publications, and events like this one today, all with the goal of promoting a strong German-American relationship. Now, these days, a day can sometimes seem like a week and a month like a year. But over the past 12 months, we at AICGS have been marking the 30th anniversary of the peaceful revolution in East Germany, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and German unification. Our objective is not to relive those days, however exciting they were, but to understand how Germany's society, its economy, and its politics have changed since unification, and what lessons that holds for us now and as we look to the future. I want to thank Dr. Eric Langenbacher, the Senior Fellow here at AICGS and Director of our program on society, culture, and politics, for his leadership in this series of events. And we're grateful for the support of the German Embassy in Washington, which helps make this event happen. And I'm especially pleased that we have a leading scholar with us today, Professor Robert Tobin of Clark University, for a discussion of how LGBTQ rights have evolved in Germany since unification. Let me hand things over to Eric Langenbacher to introduce Professor Tobin and to get us started. And once again, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Jeff, and welcome to everyone. I also want to thank the German Embassy here in Washington, D.C. for their very generous support for this 30th anniversary of Reunification series. We have other events in the works, including one that will look at environmental policy as it's evolved over the last 30 years. So please look for announcements on that topic. But I'm so pleased today to introduce our speaker, Robert Deam Tobin, who holds the Henry J. Lair Chair in Literature, Language, and Culture at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. He's been writing on LGBTQ plus issues in Germany for many years and is extensively published on the topic. Some of his books include Warm Brothers, Queer Theory in the Age of Goethe, Peripheral Desires, The German Discovery of Sex, that was from 2015. And he's also a co-editor of A Song for Europe, Popular Music and Politics in the Eurovision Song Contest. So without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to Bob, who will be talking about the evolution of LGBTQ rights in Germany since unification, called So Long, Beautiful Gay World. Bob.
Thank you very much. And it's a real honor to speak at the AICGS forum on 30 years since the fall of the wall. I actually began teaching in 1989, and so I recall from my first year of teaching while I was at the college gym, watching the wall fall on television, and really my whole career has actually been kind of aligned with the fall of the wall and the unification of Germany. And I've also been for the entire time involved in the gay and lesbian LGBTQ plus scene. So I've been a participant observer over the years. I am, of course, speaking from a white male perspective, and that'll probably become clear in the examples I draw, but hopefully as I talk, you'll be thinking of ways to augment my perspective, and we can have a good discussion about how all of this goes. So I'm gonna begin I'm gonna share the screen here. Let's see if that works. Good, okay, excellent. So let's get started now. The fall of the Berlin Wall took place on November 9th, 1989, which is already a fraught date in German history, marking the anniversary of the pogroms of Kristallnacht in 1938, as well as the end of the German Empire in 1918. For those of us interested in LGBTQ plus studies, it was an additionally interesting date because Heiner Karo's Coming Out, the first East German film to focus on gay issues, premiered in Kino International in East Berlin on that very same evening as the wall was opening. 150 years ago, in 1869, Carl Maria Kerk-Beny had been the first in any language to combine the prefix homo with the noun sexus, creating the word homosexualität to define a group of people sexually attracted to members of their own sex. Kerk-Beny did this in an open letter pleading for a change in laws to the soon-to-be unified Germany on widernatürliche Unzucht, sexual misconduct contrary to nature, which were generally applied to men engaged in homosexual behavior. Kerk-Beny's effort failed, and Germany's official identity became intertwined with paragraph 175, which criminalized male-male sexual acts, in contradistinction to countries that had adopted versions of Napoleonic jurisprudence, which generally did not criminalize private sexual behavior between adults. The birth of the new unified Germany in 1989 seemed to go hand in hand with an entirely different and celebratory message about same-sex desire. Movies like, let's see, Cameron's Mitchell's Hedwig and the Angry Itch, which came out in 2001, in which Hedwig specifically uses the fall of the Berlin Wall as a metaphor for her own gender crossing, seemed to convey this euphoric spirit. Yet, the American lesbian poet Audre Lorde, who had been visiting Berlin regularly since 1984, warned about coming dangers in her poem, East Berlin, 1989, when she wrote, "It feels dangerous now to be Black in Berlin." These tensions between celebrating and warning continue to mark the identity of Germany 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Coming out was just one of many signifiers of liberalization of sexual politics in the German Democratic Republic toward the end of the 1980s, as historian Sam Huneke has recently demonstrated. One product of this East German activism was the Schwulenverband Deutschlands, Gay Association of Germany, founded in 1990 by the man here, partly by the man here whose image you see. By 1998, it had become the Lesben- und Schwulenverband Deutschlands, the Lesbian and Gay Association of Germany. In the 2000s, it became established enough to become a recognized non-governmental organization at the United Nations, and it is now the largest LGBTQ plus organization in Germany, with a history that very much overlaps with that of unified Germany. The shift, incidentally, from Schwulenverband to Lesben- und Schwulenverband, from gay to lesbian and gay, points to the tensions between men and women in gay and lesbian organizations, which show up everywhere, but have even greater linguistic challenges in the German-speaking world, where schwul does not have the same flexibility as gay. In English, you can use gay in the sense of gay or straight, where it at least purports to include women, or you can use gay in the sense of gay and lesbian, where it refers to men as opposed to women. In modern German, schwul almost always refers only to men, which is actually one of the advantages of the word queer or queer in German, because it manages to get around that. In any case, the Schwulenverband Deutschland certainly did have political issues to carry out, despite the euphoria of the movie coming out. As did other activists, for instance, Rosa von Praunheim. German sensitivities on privacy made the outing debates that Rosa spearheaded in 1991 against closeted public media figures like Hapa Kerkeling and Alfred Biolek even more controversial than they were elsewhere. In general, however, there was an increasing acceptance of queerness in the public space, as indicated by Charlotte von Mahlsdorf's Bundesverdienstkreuz, which she accepted in 1992. She was, of course, also the star of Praunheim's 1992 film, Ich bin meine eigene Frau, and then Doug Wright's fascinating reconsideration of her life a decade later in I Am My Own Wife, the 2003 Broadway hit. In 1994, the red-green government led by Gerhard Schröder of the SPD and Joschka Fischer of the Greens finally entirely removed the detested paragraph 175 from the German Grundgesetz, the very paragraph against which Kurt Benny had campaigned in the run-up to the establishment of the German Empire. Although the CDU-SPD Grand Coalition had largely hollowed out the paragraph at the end of the 1960s, it hung on with a separate age of consent, 18 for male homosexual acts as opposed to 14 for other acts. This final remnant of paragraph 175 is what disappeared without replacement in 94, which incidentally was also the first year that Volker Beck entered parliament. He was a Green politician who had become one of the most prominent gay voices in German politics. As a tangent, or it's not really a tangent, but it's worth mentioning that a decade later, the European Court of Human Rights began voiding laws within Europe, within its jurisdiction, that established separate ages of consent for homosexual actions, first in cases involving Austria and then the United Kingdom. So this law, this remnant of 175 would have gone probably eventually anyway. I bring up this picture of Donna International because as the European Union began to project itself in the 1990s, began its project in the 1990s of expanding in size and deepening its involvement in the countries involved, gay rights became a signature issue, both for supporters and opponents. Human rights were a mainstay of the ideological justification for European unity, broadly conceived, and gay rights happened to be at the cutting edge of human rights discussions in the 1990s. Accession to the EU often meant eliminating laws against homosexuality, for which reason opponents of the EU often saw it as a threat to the traditional family. One soft indicator of this link between Europe and gay rights is the increasing queerness of the Eurovision Song Contest, culminating in Israel's victory with transgender Donna International, her song Viva la Diva in 1998. A year, incidentally, in which Germany hoped to win with Gildo hat euch lieb, if you remember that song. By the late 1990s, things seemed to be so good for gay rights in Germany that Werner Hinzpeter could publish Schöne Schwule Welt, der Schlussverkauf einer Bewegung, Beautiful Gay World, Closing Sale of a Movement, which argued that homophobia was largely eradicated, laws emphasized equality, gays were advancing professionally, private companies actively courted them, the press treated them with kid gloves, the police respected them, and religious figures were coming around. True, marriage wasn't quite in the works yet, but not many people actually wanted that. AIDS, if anything, was helping the movement stay alive. Hinzpeter's Beautiful Gay World was a kind of gay German analog to Francis Fukuyama's End of History, which had famously argued that the liberal status quo that emerged from the end of the Cold War was here to stay. The biggest problem that Hinzpeter could see was that entrenched gay political and civic organizations like the Lesbian and Gay Association of Germany would linger on, devoting energies to problems that actually didn't exist anymore. So in the celebratory multiculti pride celebrations of 1997, two features emerged that have stuck with me over the years. One was the increasing importance of Germany's gay history, the rise of gay German history as a part of its identity. Goodbye to Berlin, 100 Jahre Schwulenbewegung, was the monumental exhibit put on by the Schwules Museum and the Akademie der Künste in 1997, which can stand in as an example for this celebration of Germany's gay history. It's interesting to me, by the way, how the question of the title, Goodbye to Berlin, going back to Christopher Isherwood's 1939 novel, points to a repeated concern that the good times in Germany are always already over. Rosa von Praunheim would return to these questions of gay history cinematically in the 1990s with Schwuler Mut, Gay Courage, and The Einstein of Sex, which appeared in 1998 and 99, respectively. Max Färberbach's 1999 film, Aimé and Jaguar, about lesbian lovers in Nazi Germany, is another example of this new interest in Germany's queer past that scholars like myself have benefited from tremendously. Now at the same time, we'll keep in mind that the exhibit Goodbye to Berlin ran into considerable critique at the time because it was accused of not focusing focusing too much on traditional ideas of gay male culture and neglecting other types of queerness as well as women. In addition, at one of the programs in the Homo 2000 series organized by Rosa von Praunheim at the 1997 exhibit in the Akademie der Künste, I gave a talk actually called Fags and Flags on sexuality and nationality, where I looked at a phenomenon I was noticing of gay men no longer feeling oppressed by their governments and instead flaunting symbols of nationalism. Given Germany's past, it was all the more remarkable to see this kind of staging of eroticized masculinity in national contexts, such as the new cupola of the Reichstag in Henning von Berg's scandalous photos for Playgirl, which you see on the right there, or also the Spiegel's image of sexy naked German man doused in the colors of the German flag on its cover, also in 1997. So both these images are from 97. So this was a full 10 years before the World Cup in 2006, when the world press noted a much lighter German attitude towards its flag and towards symbols of nationalism. And so you already have that going on here. As we enter the 2000s, we see the increasing mainstreaming of LGBTQ rights, nicely captured in Marco Kreuzpainter's film Summer Storm, which perhaps built on this increasingly eroticized German body that I just mentioned by focusing on young male athletes, in this case, members of crew teams, rowing teams. The film presents new problems, such as how does one come out in a world in which everybody else seems to have figured out their sexuality. In this movie, there's a whole team of gay rowers, wittily called the Querschlag, the queer strokes, which makes the hero Toby, played by Robert Stadtlober, feel like an idiot rather than a hero when he tries to make his way out of the closet. Domestic partnerships, technically registered life partnerships with the lovely German name Eingetragene Lebenspartnerschaften, arrived in 2001 with a gradually increasing number of rights that made them very close to marriage, which of course is not the same thing as marriage. At the same time, more and more prominent politicians began coming out from a wide range of parties, including the CDU mayor of Hamburg, Ole von Beust, here seen with his partner Lukas Förster, and the liberal FDP leader Guido Westerwelle, seen here with his partner Michael Brons. Beust would serve as president of the Bundesrat for a year. Westerwelle went from being a representative of the Bundestag to a leader of the Free Democratic Party, and eventually Secretary of State of Germany, one of the first openly gay Secretary of States in the world, I think. Most famously, of course, Klaus Wowereit, who was mayor of Berlin from 2001 to 2014. He came out in 2001 in order to scoop the press, which was on the verge of revealing his sexuality. And when he did so, he added the simple but memorable affirmation, "Und das ist auch gut so," and that's a good thing too, which became famous worldwide as it flipped what might have been seen as a coming out under duress, out of fear of scandal, into a celebration of sexual identity. In general, Wowereit had a good ear for casual but distinctive language, as when he declared Berlin was arm aber sexy, poor but sexy. Under his leadership, the city became ever more schön, schrill und schwul, beautiful, crazy, and gay. The 2010s, though, have seen a reversal, perhaps, of the trajectory that we have been describing so far. Just want to check my time here. Good. That we've been describing so far, as the warning signs that Audre Lorde mentioned back in December 1989 began to flash more urgently. One might not call it, calling it a free fall might seem like a bit of an exaggeration, but it is interesting that Stéphane Lacan's film about a bisexual policeman who falls in love with another policeman came out with this title in 2013. The decade started with a bang when renowned philosopher Judith Butler rejected the Civil Courage Prize of the Berlin's Christopher Street Day celebrations. Christopher Street Day had featured this award at gay pride festivities since 2001, which was one of the ways in which the Berlin event distinguished itself from other major gay pride events. After Claudia Künast of the Green Party held a lengthy laudatio in honor of Butler, the philosopher revealed that she would not accept the prize, declaring, quote, "I must distance myself from this racist complicity." In particular, she did not want to become part of a celebration, quote, "instrumentalized by those who want to wage wars, i.e. cultural wars, by means of forced Islamophobia." Butler's linkage of gay pride with Islamophobia was, I would argue, a pointed critique of those nationalist developments that took place as Germany, Europe, and the West began to take ownership of progressive attitudes towards homosexuality. So we'll stick on this slide. That picture is where she is rejecting the prize, and I don't know if it's before or after she's rejected the prize. Anyway, in any case, the progressive attitudes, so Butler was referring to a trend that was emerging in European circles, especially in the right, that was actually more visible outside of Germany. In Holland, for instance, the openly gay Pim 14 had made a name for himself by combining nationalist politics with Islamophobia, arguing in essence that what distinguished the West was its tolerant, celebratory attitude towards homosexuality. He was assassinated in 2002, but there were others who would promote this kind of thinking, which actually often surprises Americans who tend to assume, based on our own politics, that those on the far right would automatically have traditional Christian views regarding sexual morality, and thus could not find ways to celebrate homosexuality. In any case, the progressive attitudes toward homosexuality would indeed develop in Germany throughout the decade, as they did in the United States, culminating in the arrival of full gay marriage and gay adoption in 2017, just a couple years after the Supreme Court of the United States declared gay marriage a constitutional right in 2015. At the same time, the argument that this kind of expansion of gay rights was a specifically Western Euro-American phenomenon allowed for an expansion of pro-gay far-right voices in Germany itself. A notable example is David Berger, the Roman Catholic theologian who came out in 2010 with his sensational book Der Heilige Schein, which exposed much of the church's hypocrisy regarding homosexuality. In 2013, he began a stint as editor-in-chief of Männer, one of the leading German gay journals. But within a year, the Deutsche AIDS-Hilfe stopped purchasing advertisements in the journal, concerned that under Berger's leadership, the magazine promoted a traditional view of masculinity, encouraged discrimination and exclusion, and generally toyed with populist right-wing ideas. By 2015, the magazine had forced him out of the position, which he wears as a badge of honor on his blog. He refers to the Rauswurf wegen zu offener Islamkritik, the being thrown out because of too open Islam criticism of Islam. A member of the CDU, he tweeted that he was voting for the Alternative for Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany, in 2017 in order to fight Islamization of Europe. And he was for a while in the leadership of the AfD-oriented Erasmus Foundation. Nowadays, he writes frequently in his traditionalist blog, Philosophia Perennialis, perennis, excuse me, which is where the image below with disgraced alt-right personality Milo Yiannopoulos in May of 2019 comes from, and the image on the right with Steve Bannon is from his Twitter feed, also from May of 2019, so quite recent. I'm just a slight tangent here. Philosophia perennis is a term for perennialism, which is also popular with followers of traditionalism, which is not traditional in the casual sense of the term, but rather seeking quite deep, ancient, and archaic truths that predate almost anything that anyone in the West now typically practices. And one of the thinkers associated with traditionalism and perennialism is the Italian fascist philosopher Julius Evola, who has a great influence on many in the new and the far and the alt-right, including both Yiannopoulos and Bannon, for which reason I was quite intrigued by the title of his blog, as well as the appearance of these two figures in the blog quite recently. This right-wing space is not available just for intellectuals, but also active politicians, most notably Alice Weidel, who has led the Alternative für Deutschland since at least 2017. In a civil partnership with a Swiss woman originally from Sri Lanka, who is a film producer, Weidel insists that her party is good for gays and lesbians because of its strict stance on immigration. Within the LGBTQ world, Patsy Lamore-Lelove articulated a polemical backlash against what was perceived as a regime of political correctness, in which, quote, even broaching the subject of of identity politics in the queer scene was dangerous. Lamore-Lelove's edited volume Beissreflexe, which also appeared in 2017, clarified its agenda in its subtitle. It was, in English, a critique of queer activism, authoritarian yearning, and speech prohibitions. The essays included denounce a wide variety of trends, some of which we are quite familiar with in the United States, such as trigger warnings and privilege checking. Essays defend drag queens against trans activists and rebut charges of pinkwashing with regard to Israel, or as well as gay Islamophobia. The collection sparked an enormous response with reviews throughout the German press, including Die Zeit and Die Taz, in the gay press, of course, but also in literary reviews such as literaturkritik.de. Probably because of its polemical nature, it blew open a discussion that had been simmering behind closed doors. A similar set of issues bubbled up a year ago when Die Taz published an open debate between a variety of people working at or with the Schwules Museum, the oldest and still the largest museum devoted to LGBTQ history in the world. They openly described, the contributors to this debate openly described the tensions that have emerged as a museum that initially had a focus on gay men has attempted to expand to cover lesbians, trans, non-binary, and queer people, as well as to move beyond its implicit bias towards white LGBTQ plus history and to reach out to people of color, immigrants, and those from a variety of religious backgrounds. In 2017, for instance, the museum focused on post-colonialism. 2019-20, the museum hosted the Canadian exhibit Trans, about links between trans communities on both sides of the Atlantic. And just last night, they hosted a live stream conversation called, sarcastically of course, I'm gay, I can't be racist. Another set of fault lines that emerged out of the fracturing of the LGBTQ plus coalition became clear when the Initiative Queer Nations, working with the Queeres Kulturhaus, invited Gunda Schumann to speak at an event hosted and moderated by Jan Feddersen. The title was, in English, Transgender, Gender Justice Passé. Schumann is a feminist activist who I believe published this work here on prostitution. It's the only thing I could find actually published by her in 1980. And she espouses views about trans people similar to the ones that we've been hearing about from J.K. Rowling recently, about the dangers that trans people present to established gender and sexuality structures. I will say there was a quite unified response to this proposed talk, with Queers Kulturhaus rescinding the invitation and even Feddersen regretting at least the way it was announced. And I will also add that I think the amount of work being done on trans history right now is quite impressive, from the many talks about trans issues at the recent online conference, The Past and Futures of Queer German Studies, hosted by the University of British Columbia, to the work being done by Nikki Trautwein at the Lilly Elbe Archive. I'll end on one upbeat note, which is the work I see being done by LGBTQ people throughout Germany on behalf of asylum seekers. I'm involved a little bit in this field in my hometown of Worcester, Massachusetts, and I know it presents its own challenges about what it means to be, for instance, LGB or T, and how one can prove one's status to the state in order to receive asylum based on this status. My sense is that the individuals working on these organizations in Germany are not focused on these kinds of legalistic questions, but rather on simply helping other human beings. So, is it time to bid so long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, goodbye, to the beautiful gay world? I don't think so. LGBTQ rights are increasingly codified in law, defined by institutional structures, and accepted by broad swaths of society. If anything, these developments suggest some of the next moves that are incumbent upon us. First of all, as Black Lives Matter makes clear, most societal and institutional structures need to question their racist underpinnings, and LGBTQ organizations do also. At the same time, it seems clear to me that trans issues are the issues that are of most interest to many young people today. For those of us for whom some of these issues are new, I think we need to remember that many of us didn't like the established norms of sexuality and gender either. We wanted to question them, and we wanted more fluidity. If we're getting that, it's a good thing, and it's where a lot of the legal and societal work needs to continue. This doesn't mean anyone has to lose their identity. Based on my teaching, I'm not at all concerned that gay men as a group are going to disappear in my lifetime or in the lifetime of my students. There's plenty of them. And I believe this is true of other groups in the LGBTQ+ coalition as well, with each group focusing, of course, on rights that are more specific to its own needs. In terms of the kinds of freedom of speech issues that come up with Beissreflexe, I think Hannah Arendt can help us a little bit here when she argues that the most fundamental right is the right to have rights. Rights get curtailed all the time. Because of our current pandemic, for instance, many of us have less freedom of movement and association than we used to. The important thing is to be at the table when the discussion about limitations of rights takes place. That's what Arendt means as the right to have rights. We need to make sure that everyone is at that table when we're talking about our basic rights. One thing that I think we'll need to continue to work on has to do with the differing meanings of sexual freedom. I think for many men, since at least the Marquis de Sade and Sigmund Freud, sexual freedom has meant the ability to do what one wants to do sexually. What I've learned over the years is that for others, sexual freedom only exists when one can be sure of one's sexual safety, which might actually call for more limitations on behavior. I think as long as we try to adhere to the idea that everyone needs to be at the table when we have these discussions, we can work things out in a way that allows for sexual democracy now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. That was a very, very interesting and stimulating talk. So now we will transition to the question and answer period. If I could ask any participants to type your answer or your question into the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then I will read them to Bob. So we already have a question, so I will start with this. It says, you mentioned that Judith Butler's rejection of the prize was a rejection of the nationalist resurgence of the 2000s. But wouldn't you agree it was especially pointed at queer circles themselves, which she argued were becoming far too consumerist, exclusionary, and white identified and focused? In other words, it was not simply a critique of the emergent right, it was very much a criticism of the queer center. Your thoughts?
Oh yes, yes. I should have said that. Yes. So the emerging nationalism that was um, society based and was related to queer issues in the sense that this nationalism was now attached to being that our society is a better society because it is supportive of gay rights. That this was an attitude that was particularly appealing in the gay world, and so she was definitely aiming this specifically within the community. The commercialism point, I think she probably also thought that, and it's actually what the press, a lot of the mainstream press picked up on, was that Christopher Street Day had simply become too commercial. As I read the talk, though, that she gave, she only had an offhand comment about commercialism, and she was really focused on this issue of nationalism and Islamophobia. And I think it's important to keep it focused on uh, on um, on those issues, simply because the commercialism charge, myself, I feel is awfully easy, and it ends up being a charge that one says, yeah, okay, well, but anyway, I still got to buy my Starbucks. So I'm a little bit less. I think the nationalism is the more pointed charge that I would be most interested in.
All right, we have several other questions. Here's one. What about the impact of AIDS and AIDS activists on the gay and lesbian movements in Germany?
Yes, I'm sorry. That was meant to be in there when I had the slide on the lesbian on the Schwulenverband. So the AIDS organizations, AIDS of course hits a little bit before the 1980s, and so they don't have such a perfect overlap with unified Germany. So the Deutsche AIDS-Hilfe is actually, I think, 85 or something like that, but it's very close to unified Germany. And what I would say on that is that there were some particular features about Germany, maybe Europe overall, that make it a little different than the States. That first of all, the AIDS pandemic hit the States a little bit earlier. So Germans could sort of see overwhelmed hospitals. They could see nurses and doctors being afraid to treat patients. And by the time AIDS became more prominent in Germany, there had been some chance, not to entirely overcome those kinds of fears, but there had been time to work on that. But I think most important is that Germany had a functioning health insurance system. So you didn't have people who were unable to pay for their care to the extent that you did in the States. On the other hand, I think that the activism that did emerge out of the States in ACT UP, injected a sense of urgency and militancy in the German activist world as well. That was quite interesting. And then the final thing I'll say on that is that um, one of the things that I really admire Rosa von Praunheim's AIDS trilogy, which is a little bit before Unification, I think. They're more in the 80s. But whereas in the United States, our depictions of AIDS tended to appeal to people's sympathy and pity. Rosa was already in there with kind of a biting self-critique of the movement. Who's trying to make money off of this? What organizations are trying to professionalize themselves based on this? And with a kind of campy, edgy humor that that was probably shocking to some people in the States.
All right, we have lots of...
I see, yes, 8, okay, yes.
All right, so I'll try to take them kind of in order.
Okay, and I'll maybe try not to talk too much on each one, yeah.
All right, do you find that the acceptance of queerness in Germany is linked to the visibility of queer political leaders?
I guess from my talk, you would think that, wouldn't you? I'll have to think more deeply on the assumptions that are going into that. But I guess I would almost say maybe the other way around, that the acceptance of queer political leaders shows a broader acceptance of queer people. And then where that acceptance comes from probably has to get analyzed further.
Well, if I could piggyback on that question with one of my own,
Mm-hmm.
I always think that one of the big contrasts between Germany and Europe in general and the United States is the role of religion and religiosity,
Yeah.
which is much less in Germany than here. So do you think that maybe the decline of religiosity in Germany has a lot to do with the rising acceptance of queerness?
I think so. I mean, certainly that is the center in the United States of hostility to queerness, is that, you know, big chunk of traditional evangelical Christians, not all of whom are opposed to queerness, but many of whom are. So the fact that that is not such a powerful group, and that's also why in the States it's often hard for us to understand this pro-gay branch of the far right. Because the far right in the United States is very much allied with conservative Christianity.
All right, and so the next question has to do with a law just passed by the Bundestag and now the Bundesrat, which is the law, I guess, against conversion therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any comments on that? Is this something that is supported by the general public and the queer community in Germany?
Oh yes, yeah, that was. I think queer youth have long been a focus of our interest, and yeah, I don't know anyone who is against this new law, and lots of people were calling for it.
Okay, here's a great question. In popular imagination and scholarship alike, Berlin often functions as a stand-in for all of Germany, which, as we know, it really isn't. Do you have any thoughts about how the trajectory you described looks different if we look at the other cities or
Yeah.
rural and suburban areas? And also, if there's any differences between the former East Germany and Western Germany?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, this is very Berlin-centric. I realize that, and actually, I have a lot of linkages, personal connections to Freiburg as well. And just when I came up with visuals, the Berlin ones always were the ones that ended up winning out. Um, but um, but yes, so this is too Berlin heavy, and I think that, you know, movies like Summer Storm are trying to break out of that and show a little bit of a kind of a non-urban Germany. It has seemed to me. I need to do a little bit of work to see if I can find empirical data for this, but it has seemed to me that small town Germany has been much more conservative on a lot of these issues than even small town the United States. You know, I think, you know, and again, that's perhaps has to do with my own perspective, because I am looking at a lot of small colleges and small American rural college towns that don't always, it's hard to find analogies for them in Germany. So I kind of can imagine small towns where there's a queer film festival, for instance, and my German friends would say, no, that couldn't possibly exist in a town of, you know, of 20,000. Also because Germany is much more compact, so that if you're in that town of 20,000, you can get to the town of 200,000 more quickly. But I do think, because of this quite widespread secularism in Germany, so to speak, that even small towns, even rural Germany is sort of coming around, if it has come around a little bit more slowly. On the East question, I'm hesitant to make a, you know, it seems to me the bigger distinction is urban and non-urban. So, you know, my sense is that towns like Leipzig and Dresden have a lot going on in their queer scenes as well, but that the smaller towns are harder.
Okay, here's a question about media. Could you say a bit more about the evolution of the gay media landscape in Germany since 1990? Has there been the same decline in gay print media that we have had in the United States? And have new online media become central?
Um, so for yes, and maybe. The print media is declining. One of the things that draws me to Germany is actually its strong print culture, and so I feel like when I mentioned with Beissreflexe, for instance, all of these daily newspapers that are running reviews of it, it's hard to imagine something similar in the United States. So aspects of the print media are still quite strong comparatively, but the gay scene is definitely in decline, and certain magazines that used to exist don't publish anymore, except for maybe on an online format. And what I also notice is, I guess it's a good thing, but I still, it is part of my own personal nostalgia. I feel that when I used to go to a gay German city, the local gay magazine listed everything, at the back of what was going on. And increasingly, it seems like many queer events now advertise online on their own, and you kind of have to find them, and they're not showing up in the gay magazines. So that's a bit of a disappointment, and so things are moving to online, but I don't think that move is entirely worked out yet. You really do have to do some searching now for things, and that's something I hope we figure out.
So here's actually a comment that I think is really quite well put, and that is, we shouldn't forget that yes, Berlin ist anders, Berlin's different, but one of the ways that it's different in this context is that it's a global gay hub. Right, so it's not just the kind of the capital city, the big city, where everything's happening as you see in other countries, but it really is one of the most important kind of international centers for all aspects of queerness. So I think that's a very interesting point to bring up. So here's a question: can you speak further on LGBTQ plus persecution as a means of seeking asylum in Germany and Europe more generally? In the US, this is not yet a solidified route of applying for asylum. Does the EU have laws regarding this thus far?
I believe that these are national laws, and that you can claim asylum. Based on the persecution of your sexual orientation in your home country, and for some time, actually. You've been able to do this in Germany. The challenge is proving your identity. So many people who are, I'm going to use queer just as a, well, actually I won't, because that's another issue I want to bring up. So many people who are lesbian or gay or bisexual or trans often had to live in hiding, had to hide their identity in their home countries. That's why they're fleeing. And that hiding means that it's very hard to prove what their identity is now. And so it's a real challenge. And not only that, but often, because of their upbringing, they tend to be more conservative. So they weren't actually, marching down the streets, flaunting their sexuality. So that is a real challenge. There's challenges like how do you prove your identity if you've been celibate your whole life, if you're a virgin? And so the government will say, well, how do you know you're gay or lesbian? I think, even bisexual is a little bit hard. Queer, I think, trying to gain asylum to the state because you have some sort of fluid, non-specific identity is, I think, very difficult. You kind of have to make this story that claims a certain identity. So these are all real challenges, and also intellectually, they're sort of challenges when I think about what I think about it means to have a sexual identity. But what we're usually referring to is individuals who need help. So I'm willing to come to accommodate any kind of construction that we can to get them to be helped.
All right, we have a few more minutes left, and I actually have a ton of questions that I'd also like to ask. But, Bob, in your kind of experience, how do you think the evolution of LGBTQ plus rights has evolved in Germany compared to other European countries or places like the United States? Do you think Germany is kind of ahead of the curve, behind the curve? Does it depend on what particular policy we're talking about?
Yeah, I think uh, Germany's wealth and power have enabled these organizations to be quite substantial. So to that extent, they often are more developed than countries that have devoted less resources to them. So that makes them stronger. I think in a funny way, I mentioned this about the German relationship to privacy. In some ways, I think for a lot of Germans, the idea of, you know, that your sexuality should even play a role was something that was quite disturbing to them, and they felt, you know, no, this really is a private matter. And so that has held back the political debates a little bit in Germany, I think, and it's taken some time for people to kind of embrace the notion that the personal is political. So those would be a couple issues where I see differences going on. You know, on the other hand, we don't want to exaggerate the differences. It is striking to me how, you know, something like conversion therapy, that moves from one country to another, and kind of everyone, you know, looks to the neighboring countries to see, okay, what are they doing? Okay, that's going to be our project.
Okay, and I also wanted to mention something about paragraph 175
Mm-hmm.
and its kind of after effects. So back in 2002, the Bundestag, I guess, annulled all the Nazi era convictions under the, I guess, sharpened revision of that aspect of the code. And then in 2017, because I think that there were some prosecutions all the way until 1994, when they got rid of that from the penal code. But in 2017, they gave pardons to anybody who had been prosecuted under that provision. And then they also, I think, gave out 3,000 euros in compensation, and then more if you had actually been incarcerated due to a conviction under that. So that's just a couple of years ago that that happened. Is there any discussion or debate in the queer community about that, about the pardoning and then the compensation efforts? I.e., I mean, do people think that it's inadequate? Has there been a push to try to increase the amount of compensation?
I have not heard of that. I think there is acknowledgement that this is a symbolic gesture, and you know, I think people are happy to move forward. And as far as I know, there's nothing like that in the United States, so that's interesting.
Okay, and then the final thing that I kind of wanted to bring up is to kind of move back to the AFD for a second.
Oh yeah.
And this whole notion of homo nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, why do you think that the far right is embracing kind of gay rights as, you know, part of their new kind of right-wing platform and identity?
Well, and so I think I actually have two lines of thought on this. So one is the one that I kind of brought up with Pim Fortuyn, where I think there is an argument that this is one step forward in essentially in the Enlightenment and Western progress towards tolerance and freedom, and it's something we need to fight for and defend, and it's a real you know, accomplishment of European civilization. So that's that argument. But I also think that there is a darker side to this, which is not really articulated, so it's a little bit hard to prove. But I think there is also, in some of these thinkers, a real actual just glorification of the strong man, that is an eroticized glorification of the strong man, and that is what actually links into some of the kind of more fascist tendencies and fascist aesthetics. So I think some of that also lurks underneath, and as I say, it's a little bit hard to prove, and it would almost always be denied by anyone who you accused of doing this, but I do think it's behind there. And then the other thing we need to remember is that also on the far right, there are, it's a coalition sort of thing. And once you dig down, the coalition isn't so 100% different from the United States. So over in France, for instance, Marine Le Pen had people who would argue along these pro-gay lines, but she's also allied with ultra-Orthodox Catholics and has also said she would actually roll back a lot of gay rights legislation if she could. So there are some contradictory attitudes there, and this is also true in the AfD.
All right, well, we have time for one more question, and luckily we have one. And that is, as a consequence of the Schengen Agreement, there's obviously freedom of movement between EU member states. So has Germany become a bit of a destination or even refuge for LGBTQ plus individuals from less liberal countries like Poland or Hungary?
Oh, I'd have to look at the statistics. It makes sense, but there are also a lot of other liberal places to go, Amsterdam or whatever. So, you know, so maybe the movement travels in different ways. But it makes some sense to me that from Hungary or Poland, you might want to move to Vienna or Berlin.
All right, well, so we're basically at time. I want to thank everyone who participated in today's webinar, and I want to extend my special gratitude to Professor Robert Tobin for giving us such a really wonderful presentation and then engaging in a vigorous Q&A. So thank you very much. And we look forward to future webinars and other events, hopefully in person someday, where we can invite everybody in person. So anyway, take care and have a good day.
Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks for this chance to walk down memory lane. And if you didn't get a chance to send your question in, you can look me up at Clark University, Tobin, and send me an email. So goodbye, everyone.